This is team leadership for church planting, and one of the things that didn't make it into the bio, but maybe should have, is I'm also a pastor at Cities Church here in Minneapolis, which is a church plant out of Bethlehem Baptist Church. We've been going for about 2 years, and so I want to make a couple of disclaimers about what I'm going to talk about today as we get going. So we planted Cities Church 2 years ago. At the time, 2 of our founding pastors had been elders at Bethlehem for a number of years. I've been active as a professor at Bethlehem for a number of years. Been there now 11 years here in Minnesota. And one of our other pastors was that planted that church was a Bethlehem Seminary graduate and had been out of seminary for a couple of years doing some ministry. So, but I want to say that so we've only been doing this for 2 years, and so you ought to take everything I say with a massive grain of salt. Okay, so it's really easy, I think, for guys who are doing church planting and who've only been doing it for a couple years to get up here and kind of say, this is how you've got to do it. Well, when a guy's only been doing it for 2 years, you ought to think, that's a good idea, let's wait and see. And so I just want to flag that and not make it come off stronger than it otherwise could. At the same time, I will say that my confidence in the benefits of team leadership in church planting has only grown in the last 2 years. Of all the things that we've done as a church, when we started, we felt like we were kind of performing an experiment. One, in fact, that many people said, that won't work, you won't be able to do that. And 2 years in, again, only 2 years in, the experiment has, for us, been a resounding success. We've been very pleased with the way God has blessed this experiment. So that's the first disclaimer. Second one, for the purpose of this message, I'm assuming that all of you already embrace the biblical teaching on plurality of eldership. So I'm not going to prove that from the Bible. I'm going to assume that you come here committed in principle to some kind of team leadership in church planting or in church in general, even if you're in a church context right now where that's not happening, either because you don't have elder qualified men in your church or you haven't formed your team and it's not happened yet. In principle, you're thinking, that's where I'm headed. So I'm assuming that. So I'm going to assume a lot on the biblical, theological, exegetical side. I'm not going to prove it, but that's going to enable us to talk about some practical things. Third disclaimer. I'm going to try to describe the benefits of our model of team leadership. And in order to do that, I'm going to necessarily be drawing a contrast with other ways of expressing team leadership. Okay, so I'm going to say this is how we're doing it, and I'm going to say, and that's different from this other way of doing it, which all of you are going to be probably familiar with. Most notably, the senior pastor model, or here in, we came out of Bethlehem, so pastor for preaching and vision model. That's the main church context I know from the inside other than what we're doing. And so there's a self-conscious kind of contrast happening there. But it would be easy to assume that in drawing that contrast, I'm offering a critique, and that's not what I'm doing. The contrast is for purposes of clarity. Okay, so this is really important because it would be really easy to think, oh, these young guys think they got a chip on their shoulder about what they came out of, and so now they're going to come say all the bad things about where they came from and how they're going to do it right. And that's not what this is. The only reason we've been able to perform this experiment, and you'll see why it's an experiment in a minute, is because we're standing on the shoulders of the grace of God at Bethlehem Baptist Church. That's the only reason this has worked. And so there's no chip on the shoulder. There's nothing but gratitude for where we've come from. And yet it's different. It's self-consciously different. So that's what I want to try to draw attention to here today. So with that as kind of 3 disclaimers, let's dive in. So I'm assuming again that all of you embrace the plurality of eldership in a local church and therefore embrace some notion of team leadership. But I want to try to draw a distinction between 2 ways of expressing a plurality of eldership. The first and most common, one that I'm guessing most of you are either a part of or familiar with, is what you might call the senior pastor model. And whether you call that so this is one main preacher, whether you call him the senior pastor, whether you call him pastor for preaching and vision, whatever you call him, there's one guy who preaches probably 75% or more of the time. 40 Sundays a year, 40 to 45, sometimes 40 to 48. He takes 4 weeks of vacation, and that's when you get somebody else in the pulpit. As a result, that one pastor is the most visible public member of the church's leadership because he's up there every Sunday opening God's word and feeding the flock. Here's how Bethlehem has described the relationship. This is really helpful. It was really clear when I heard Pastor Jason talk this way about the relationship between the pastor for preaching and vision and the rest of the elder council. So in that model, all elders are equal. There is no difference at one level, and yet there is a first among equals, just as Peter stood up among the 12. The pastor for preaching and vision is Peter standing up among the 12. Or you might think of this as a Mosaic model of leadership. So the pastor for preaching and vision, like Moses, goes up on the mountain to receive the vision. So God is the one who gives the vision. The pastor for preaching and vision receives that vision and then casts that vision. And then the elders, like the elders of Israel halfway up the mountain, are the keepers and guardians of that vision. And the refiners, perhaps, of that vision. So in that model, you still have team decision-making. Everybody's equal at one level. Everybody's got the same vote. Nobody's got more of a vote than somebody else. But there is a deliberate difference between the senior pastor, the guy who goes up on the mountain, and the rest of the pastors and elders. And obviously, there's biblical precedent. Like Peter stood up among the 12, and Moses did go up on the mountain. And so there's biblical precedent. So again, what we're talking about here is not issues of biblical fidelity per se. These are areas of Christian prudence and wisdom. This is what makes sense, what is good and wise. So that's the context in which we're having this discussion. The other way of expressing plurality is what I'm calling for this message team leadership, which includes both team decision-making and team preaching. And so for us, and this is just going to get it concrete, this isn't to be slavishly imitated or that everybody needs to get these ratios, but just to give you an idea of what that actually means on the ground. That means our lead pastor, who's vocational, preaches about half the time, so 25 sermons a year. I preach about a quarter of the time, that's about once a month. And then one of our other pastors, David Mathis, preaches a little less than a quarter. And then we have 4 other pastors on our team, and they preach about once or twice a year each. So that's the basic breakdown. So 50%, 25%, less than 25%, and then the rest of the guys who are non-vocational preaching about once or twice a year. At the same time, it's also worth noting our liturgy is a little bit different than other churches. We have both a sermon, the typical 30 to 35-minute sermon, and we also have an exhortation, which is our on-ramp to confession of sin. So there's this 5 to 7-minute slot in our liturgy every week that's another opportunity for someone to address the congregation. And so we use that, and that too is kind of divided up amongst the pastors. There's actually, I think, more. I don't know that Jonathan does 50% of those. We actually get more guys to get at bats through the exhortation time. So there's 2 times in our service when somebody's going to be either opening the word or addressing the congregation, and those are roughly the ratios. Again, not to be slavishly followed, but to give you a sense of the difference of what we're talking about. So with that in mind, so that's the contrast, the kind of senior pastor model, and then this what I'm calling team leadership, team preaching model. So I want to talk for the rest of the time about benefits. So I got 9 benefits that we've seen from this model, again, in the 2 years that we've been doing it. First, benefits for the congregation. Number 1, team preaching accents in a very helpful way the supremacy of the word over the supremacy of personality. So Phillips Brooks famously defined preaching as truth through personality. Team preaching is truth through multiple personality. And this helps our congregation, we believe. It helps us because different styles, approaches, instincts, personalities resonate with different people in your congregation. I'm a professor, and I sometimes preach like one. Okay? One of our elders is an engineer, and he preaches like one. Okay? We've got guys who are have different accents, both literally and figuratively. Like they actually speak differently, and that helps people hear different things. Different aspects of the text are going to rise to the surface for different of our pastors, and those things are going to get addressed. And this helps to round out our congregation so that we don't get stuck in a rut. The diversity of preaching takes the accent off of any one person and places it on the Bible, which is the common thread that unites all of us. So that's one benefit that we've seen in team preaching. Number 2, team preaching balances the strengths and weaknesses of any one pastor. All of you know this, I suspect, but over time, in a typical senior pastor model, the church will take on the instincts, the emphases, the quirks, the personality traits of their primary leader. Just over time, that there will be a kind of conforming to that main preacher. That's as it should be. That's inevitable. Just like a home is going to take on the character of dad if he's present, so also the pastor, the main one doing that preaching week in and week out, he will influence for good and for ill. The church is a ship, and the pulpit steers the ship. The preacher will shape the congregation over time, and so team preaching allows the strengths and gifts of one pastor to balance out the weaknesses of another pastor. It helps to avoid imbalances and ruts that can sometimes come when the primary preacher is the same person week after week, year after year. So that's the second benefit, is it balances and rounds out the congregation. Third, it's also good for the congregation to see the lead pastor learn from other people. Okay, I think it's a very sad thing, and I know that sometimes this is unavoidable, so don't hear me, this isn't again a criticism, but it's sort of a, if only this could happen more often, where I've known churches where the only time the senior pastor was out of the pulpit was when he was on vacation, which means his congregation never saw him sit under somebody else and be benefited. And there's something really meaningful, I think, for a congregation to be reminded that before that pastor is a shepherd, he's a sheep. Before he's a leader, he's a disciple. And that's visibly evident, at least in our church, week in and week out, when Jonathan sits down front row with his family and listens to me or David Mathis or any of our other pastors preach the word. This last weekend, it was our worship pastor. He gave a wonderful exposition on liturgy. And it's good for our congregation to see we need to hear the word too. We need to have the word strike us. Like, they don't get to see you guys here. They're not here to witness you sitting under the preaching of the word and being benefited. And so it's good for them week in and week out to see that mutual respect, gratitude, and appreciation that we all have for each other in our ministries. So that's number 3. Number 4, now we're going to move into benefits for the pastor. So that was benefits for the congregation. Here's benefits for the pastor himself. Number 4, the lead pastor is a shepherd, not just a preacher. The lead pastor is a shepherd, not just a preacher. We do have a lead pastor. He's full-time. He's vocational. He's paid by the church. However, we deliberately call him lead pastor rather than say pastor for preaching because we want the ministry to be in language rounded out. He is to do all of the things that pastors should do, which is more than just preach. He still devotes most time of anyone among us to thinking about the church, to mission, to vision. He's the one who's working on the ship day in and day out. I've got a day job. Other guys have day jobs. But he's not just a preacher. He's a pastor. He does all the things that we want all of our pastors to do. Put another way, team leadership helps us to avoid a kind of hyper-specialization, which really can afflict ministries, where you've got different aspects of ministry that you silo off and you say, you're the specialist when it comes to children. You're the specialist when it comes to youth. You're the specialist when it comes to missions. You're the specialist when it comes to small groups. And everything gets siloed off in those ways, and those silos can build up over time, and they can calcify in a church, and then you get territories, little fiefdoms, and you can have conflict as a result of that. We've tried to mitigate that by saying we want our lead pastor to be doing all of those things to one degree or another. Not necessarily. So, and I don't want to overstate it. He needs to be counseling. We want him actually doing counseling ministry, and not just saying counseling is something that we'll get a pastoral counselor, and that's his job. We want him doing evangelism, not just saying we're going to get a pastor who's going to do evangelism. We want him to do all of the things that a pastor should do, meeting with people, having coffee with people, hearing about marriage struggles, doing premarital counseling for young folks in our church. We want him to be doing all of those things, and the only way he's going to be free to do that is if we don't demand, you better have a really good sermon again and again and again and again, week after week. It's unavoidable that you begin to have the specialization. So I oversee our ministry to family and children, but I also lead one of our missional communities. But I also regularly preach, and our other pastors are also heavily involved in our ministry to families and children, and they also lead community groups, our missional communities. Our worship pastor does spend a lot of time focusing on the Sunday service, but he also does events, and he also does small groups. And as in new churches, you're going to have that, everybody, all hands on deck to do everything. So there is some specialization, don't mishear me, but we want to avoid the silos. Our lead pastor, we want him to be free to do counseling, evangelism, administration, and because he's vocational, he's able then to lead the rest of us as we want to grow in these areas. because he's actually been doing evangelism and then can come back and challenge us on, I was talking to my neighbor about Jesus and this is what happened. Let's pray about that. And that's an encouragement to me to hear him doing that week in, week out. Or here's pastoral counseling things that have come up and let's talk about that. That benefits me as a non-vocational pastor. I love the fact that our lead pastor is the front door to the church, that he has the freedom to line up on Thursday afternoons, or Thursdays, just line up meeting after meeting after meeting with new people or members of our church who need to get time with him, because he doesn't have the pressure that he's got to have another killer sermon on Sunday, because this week I'm up, and the next week Mathis is up, and the next week so-and-so's up. He runs our membership classes. He casts vision and mission for new people. He's free to be a well-rounded pastor because we don't expect him to carry the entire preaching load. So that's number 4. It's good. It's good for the pastor to be more than a preacher, but a pastor. Number 5. Team. This one's huge. This one may be one of the most important ones that at least I've seen in my own life. Team leadership kills ambition and envy. When we set out to do this, we were told by multiple people that it wouldn't work. You can't do this over time. It will blow up in your face, because seminary-trained, young buck church planners will not be able to work together and share the spotlight. It won't be able to do that. There will be competition, rivalry, conflict, which will hamper the growth of your church because everybody's going to be jockeying to be the guy. And I know my own heart, and I've been around enough young buck church planners to know that that could be true. That can happen. But for us, that's a reason to do it, not a reason to avoid it. Like, if that's in my heart, if the ambition and envy and the elbowing is in there, then, man, let's get it out. And if team leadership helps to get that on the table, then, God, get it out there and then kill it. I know that heading into seminary, my mentality was, I can't wait until I have a church. It was subtle. It's real subtle. I can't wait. I've called to ministry. I can't wait till I have a church. I want my church. This is my church. I was hungry for the pulpit. And since then, I've actually seen guys in seminary who get excited about church planting, and they start to form a team, and then they're getting really excited about, hey, we're going to go do this. And then all of a sudden, there's that awkward conversation where they go, oh, I thought I was going to be the pastor for preaching a vision. No, I thought I was going to be the pastor for preaching a vision. Oh, maybe you should go start your church, and I'll go start my church. They can't decide who will be the guy. Put another way, team preaching mitigates the danger of the celebrity pastor. And that's true of the celebrity, like national pastor who's speaking at conferences, but it's also true just in a congregation of the guy. And after the moral failure of so many young, high-profile celebrity pastors, you ought to be terrified of what you're capable of. I'm scared to death of what my sin might do to me, to my family, to my church, if it's not checked. If you're in the grip of the wrong kind of ambition. Holy ambition loves to share the spotlight. This conference, gospel ambition. Gospel ambition loves to share the spotlight. Gospel ambition loves to say, here, let this guy talk. He must become greater, I must become less. And it's hard to become less when you're the only guy who's seen more and more. It's hard to become less in that context. So I've said before, I think even at one of these conferences, that one of the greatest dangers facing the young, restless, and reformed is envy, and I believe that. I think that sharing the pulpit through team leadership is a great way to expose and kill that envy. Because when you listen to your fellow pastor preach on a passage, maybe one that you love, and he nails it, and people get helped, and they're saying, man, that was an encouragement. And it forces you to face the question, how am I going to respond to this? Am I going to be chafing at his ministry success? That people really love to hear him preach and get benefit from him? Or am I going to be thrilled that God is moving through somebody else? Team leadership cultivates a humility in all of the pastors, since it forces us to be defined by the grace of God and not by the pulpit. 6, move to benefits for the pastor's family. Team leadership frees pastors to be husbands and fathers. Most church planners are husbands and fathers with young families. Looking around the room, that seems to be true here too. Team leadership is good because it frees all of the pastors to regularly worship with their families, to be present on Sunday morning with their wives and kids in the pews, and not to have the pressure of performing up on stage. It's good for my wife Like, it's been we didn't know getting into this thing, are we going to like pastoral ministry, given that I have all these responsibilities at Bethlehem College and Seminary? Is this going to be too much? It's not been too much because I can be with them on Sunday mornings a lot of the time. I can be sitting there and I can be the one to correct the kids when they're talking too loud or when they're getting unruly. I can be the one to take them out of the service because I'm not needed in the service. There's 6 other guys who are able to carry the weight week in and week out. It relieves the burden on the pastor's wives to not be the wife who has everything together and is the model for all women in the church. But there's lots of models for what life might look like. The load is widely distributed, and that's good for young families. Number 7, benefits for team dynamics. We've felt that team leadership makes for stronger team decision making. So this is a place where I'm going to draw a contrast, and I don't mean it to be mainly a criticism because there's other benefits that I'm not talking about of that model. But here's one of the things. In a senior pastor model, it's normal, it's expected that the first among equals, the receiver and caster of the vision, will have a greater intangible weight on the pastoral council. It's just kind of unavoidable that the guy who's going up on the mountain and coming down is going to exert a different kind of pressure, even if officially he really checks himself and doesn't try to force his way. And even if the other guys have strong biblical backbones to push back when they think that he's wrong, it's still the case that's what first among equals means. We felt that team leadership decreases that distinction among pastors so that one voice doesn't dominate. Mine, Jonathan's, Mathis's, any of the other guys. It's harder for there to be like a top dog. We've had guys ask, who's the buck stopper? Who's the actual guy that makes the decision? It's like, well, it's the team that does, and we have to hash it out. And there's something about the visibility on Sunday mornings that enables the private meeting when the pastors are getting together on Thursdays, that enables a different kind of boldness and backbone in those meetings among all of us, that we've felt there's a tangible thing happening there. Team preaching has fostered an environment where our different instincts, and we do have different instincts on different questions. There's certain dangers that I'm hyper attuned to in terms of what this church where we could go, and there's other ones that the other guys are attuned to, and we need those on the table to make good decisions. And we felt that team leadership, and that can be true. It totally can be true of a senior pastor model. Don't mishear me. It can totally be true there. It just takes more work to make sure that lead guy is not the one who's always imposing his way, because he's the one who went up on the mountain and he came down, and so you've got to really work harder to do it. So it does slow things down. There's lots of times where we just get in an impasse and we just have to say, we're going to kick it to next week. Trust the Lord with it. But we hope it makes for better decisions. Number 8, team leadership makes for a stable and resilient team in the face of sickness, trials, and crises. So at some point, the senior pastor is going to get unfathomably sick on Saturday night. Like, it's going to happen. He's just going to be leveled by something. Or one of his kids is going to end up in the hospital, and he needs to be there, not on the pulpit. Some other calamity is going to strike. Something's going to happen, and he can't be there. And churches have been dealing with that with all different kind of models for years, okay? But we've felt that team leadership makes those situations easier to face and just roll with it, because the pastor and the church are used to a diversity of leadership. It's not unusual for there to be a different guy up there every different week. And so if all of a sudden we got to pull an audible on Saturday night or Sunday morning, we can do that because we've got enough guys who feel comfortable overseeing, managing, and leading our service from start to finish. In fact, we've talked about doing a fire drill at some point where the guy who's up just kind of calls on Saturday and says, "Can't be there, guys, it's on you," and just, see what happens. Let the non-vocational guys just go with it. I think they'd handle it beautifully. Number 9, this is what we're talking about, benefits for church planting. Team preaching is good because it enables a church to develop new leaders and give them opportunities to exercise their gifts. That can be true, again, don't want to draw hard and fast lines. That can be true in other models as well, of course. But we very much want to plant churches. That's why we did what we did. Bethlehem has just invested in us, and we wanted to launch out and be a part of a multiplying church planting movement in the Twin Cities. And And so our liturgy with the exhortation time and the sermon time and our model of team leadership provides ample opportunity for us to give young guys, young up-and-coming leaders, chances. First at like a 5 to 7 minute exhortation, then into a sermon, and that's a totally normal thing. Our congregation doesn't think something weird is happening if somebody other than the lead pastor preaches. And so it gives those guys a chance to develop their own voice, for us to give really pointed feedback. We give really detailed feedback whenever our non-vocational guys or our church planting interns go up in the pulpit. And we have the freedom, we have the time and ability to do that. And we've got enough guys who have preached to know this has helped me in the past to get ready for a sermon. So there's all kinds of benefits of being able to invest in younger guys so that over time we hope we've got, it will be easy for us to say, we're going to launch this church out, and they've got 2 or 3 guys who have had chances to preach, and this isn't just going to be baptism by fire for them. All right, let me end with a couple of objections and questions. So I'm thinking there's probably some questions here, and so I'm going to try to anticipate some, and maybe if I got a few minutes left, I might even throw it open and you guys could ask 1 or 2. So number 1, what if, this is a common one, what if one preacher's just a better communicator than the others on the team, right? You just got one guy who's a better communicator, and the people really like hearing him more than, they get more help, more benefit from his expository exaltation than the other guys. For us, this is an opportunity for all of our pastors to grow in their ability, okay? So if there's weakness, we want to cultivate, we want to develop, and not just outsource or specialize and say, you're the preaching guy. So we give that extensive feedback so that our non-vocational guys can grow in their handling of God's word. I think we also want to be mindful that giftedness in the pulpit is not the primary quality that God looks for in a stable shepherd. That's one gift, and it's a great gift that someone can open the word and exposit it. But there's a danger if that becomes the main thing, is he's the guy who can draw the crowd on Sunday. In the local church context, preaching is only one of the things that a pastor is called to do. And there are many gifted communicators who are able to avoid growing and developing in other aspects of their ministry because they don't have to. They're always going to have the pulpit because that's what they're good at. They're good in front of a crowd, but their people skills languish. And it's okay for their people skills to languish because they can do it on Sunday morning. They can perform in the pulpit. We want to develop guys who press into those weaknesses. I know my weaknesses. And it's good that I'm not the guy who can just retreat into the pulpit because I could do that. There's a part of me that sinfully wants to do that. It's good that I have to actually be with the people, learning to develop those weaknesses in my own life. So even if one's better communicator than the others, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Develop the other guys and make this guy become a well-rounded pastor. Second objection question. That sounds great, maybe, for our situation, but can you really reproduce that, right? So our situation does have some uniquenesses, okay? Our 3 regular preachers all came to seminary thinking we were going to be lead pastors. That's why I came to seminary. That's why Jonathan came to seminary. That's why David Mathis came to seminary. We were going to be lead pastors. And it just turns out that 2 of us have been called into other ministries. So I'm a professor, Mathis is an editor, but we both have ministry jobs that kind of scratch the itch for ministry. So that maybe is a unique thing about our situation that may not be reproducible everywhere. At the same time, so most churches don't have that option, right? You don't have a seminary close by that you can have a pastor be a second guy be a preacher. At the same time, many churches do have multiple paid pastors. You've got a senior pastor and a worship pastor and a children and youth pastor and an executive pastor, whatever the combination is. And all I'm suggesting is that those roles be reconfigured maybe, at least consider it, reconfiguring them so that those assistant pastors are regularly given opportunities to preach on Sunday. And the lead pastor takes on other responsibilities at the church that stretch him in different ways. So even though our situation is unique, given our context, I do think it's reproducible in other church contexts. Finally, a question, and I think this may be real for a lot of you guys. Is this really feasible for small churches? What if you're the only guy, and all you've got is a couple of guys who might be elders in a couple of years? And I just want to say, take the pressure off. You don't, this is a way. This is not biblical fidelity. This is not you're doing it wrong if you can't make this happen. It's totally fine. If you're the guy in that church and you're doing your best to preach 48 Sundays a year and you're doing all the things, praise God. Praise God. What I want to do is set up in your mind maybe a vision of what things might look like if God blesses your church down the road and you start to grow. rather than thinking, I want to grow so that I can keep the pulpit for those 48 times and then hire somebody else to do all the admin stuff that I hate. Or hire somebody to manage the youth because that's hard for me. I want to say, maybe don't think about, I'm going to hold on to the pulpit, but is there a way for us to bring other guys into this who can preach, who can shepherd, who can do the whole thing that a pastor can do? So just a little different vision of where you might be headed if you're a small church with a single pastor right now. As I said at the beginning, my aim's not to, I'm not critiquing. I want to commend another way of expressing our shared commitment to a plurality of shepherds in a local congregation. Aside from the particulars of our situation, team leadership, including team preaching and the effects that has on team dynamics and decision-making, has been an incredible blessing for our church. An incredible blessing for our church. We've experienced the kindness of God on our congregation, on our own sanctification, on our families, on our team, and we're praying that the Lord continues that kindness as we make disciples, develop leaders, and plant churches in Twin Cities and beyond.